Set in the 1920s, the film begins in a small town in Shanghai, China, where the serious and studious bacteriologist Walter Fine settles down with his wife Kitty. She does not look at all comfortable in this rural, lower-class environment, given that only 2 years ago she was enjoying the most luxurious parties in London. At one of those events, she met Walter, who fell in love with her at first sight and asked her to dance. The next day, Kitty learns that her father invited Walter to the party, hoping he would win his daughter's heart. Although she isn't interested in marriage, her mother makes it clear that they can no longer keep supporting her at home. This angers Kitty so much that she leaves. Right at the front door, she bumps into Walter, who wanted to give her a gift. Simply to get away from her family, Kitty plays along with Walter, and they go for a walk. A few minutes later, Walter musters up the courage to propose marriage. Even though they've known each other for only a short time, Kitty immediately answers that she sees him only as a friend, to which Walter responds that in time she will grow to love him and that he will do anything to make her happy. Even so, Kitty goes back home without giving him a definite answer, only to overhear her mother on the phone calling her a lost cause. Out of sheer spite, Kitty accepts Walter's proposal, and they move in together at a mansion in Shanghai. During their first days, Walter is so respectful that Kitty must encourage him to be more romantic. Although he has his passionate moments, he is almost always engrossed in his work, while Kitty is dying of boredom. Walter then mentions that they have received an invitation from the Townsends, a British couple living in Shanghai. Kitty isn't initially very excited, but that changes when she meets Charles Townsend, a very handsome vice consul. While Walter silently watches the play, Charles explains everything that's happening on stage to Kitty, who listens, enchanted. One day when Walter is not at home, Kitty invites Charles over to have sex. Hacer el delicioso. In the midst of this, they notice someone trying to turn the doorknob, but fortunately for the lovers, Kitty had locked it. Even so, she suspects it might have been Walter. Charles reassures her that even if it were him, he wouldn't have done anything about their affair. Before leaving, Charles kisses Kitty affectionately, making her feel happier than ever. Stepping out of her room, Kitty finds a package her husband left for her when she was asleep. On another day, Walter confesses to his wife that they must move to a small town called Meitanfu, where a rampant cholera outbreak has erupted and urgently needs attention. Kitty refuses to go since it doesn't sound like an ideal plan for a lady. The moment Walter hears that, he threatens to file for divorce on grounds of adultery and expose her affair with Charles. Kitty suggests that she be the one to divorce him instead, so as not to cause a scandal. While she regrets hurting him, she insists that her love for Charles is mutual. Furious, Walter calls her a spoiled woman he never should have married. But according to Kitty, it is a husband's responsibility to ensure his wife remains faithful. After all, he knew he was marrying someone who didn't love him. Looking for a way out, Kitty interrupts one of Charles's meetings to tell him everything. It turns out Walter has agreed to a discreet divorce on the sole condition that Charles also divorce his wife. There lies the problem, since that would ruin the vice consul's reputation. He refuses, and Kitty leaves disappointed, recalling that Walter was certain her lover would let her down. Consequently, she ends up joining Walter on the trip to Meitanfu, traveling along dangerous cliffs and seeing a bunch of coffins leaving the village. Upon arriving, the couple settles into an abandoned shack that is nothing like their former mansion. Naturally, Walter sees it as the perfect punishment for his wife. Shortly afterward, they receive a visit from Waddington, the local British deputy commissioner and their only neighbor, since the rest have died from cholera as he had warned them. Colonel Yu, who is in charge of the area, assigns a guard to their home, as a few days ago some British soldiers shot Chinese workers during a protest. Since then, Chinese nationalists have sworn vengeance on foreigners, although Walter doubts they would dare approach a cholera-infested town. Walter then goes to the village to see the cholera patients in person, having only studied the disease in a lab. The scene is worse than he imagined. Dozens of people are dehydrated, extremely thin, and constantly vomiting. Meanwhile, Kitty is also having a hard time, feeling so trapped that she writes a letter to Charles, confessing that without him, her life is unbearable. She then stops by Waddington's house, accidentally stumbling upon his lover, the young Wang Shi. Kitty prefers to ignore this and asks about the mail. Waddington explains that since the outbreak, they can neither send nor receive anything. Nevertheless, he offers to send her letter by other means. Although on seeing it's addressed to Charles, he remarks that Charles is quite famous for his extramarital affairs. Heartbroken, Kitty returns home and tears up the letter, realizing she was not as special to Charles as she had believed. After investigating the village well, Walter concludes that it's contaminated and decides to seal it, incurring the wrath of the locals, who don't understand why. While Walter works tirelessly at the hospital, Kitty spends time with Waddington, who notices how unhappy she is in her marriage, despite her attempts to keep up appearances. Impressed by the doctor's effort, the mother superior of the local orphanage invites Kitty to meet the children. As she tours the orphanage, the mother superior heaps praise on her husband, who often helps the children in the infirmary. Kitty returns home with a different opinion of Walter, finding him asleep in his office from working so much. When he wakes up, she shows interest in his research, but he still treats her coldly. Kitty then asks if he truly despises her that much, and Walter replies that he despises only himself for having loved her once. Time passes, and the number of cholera deaths grows. But Walter keeps working and bringing joy to the children at the orphanage. Moved by her husband's dedication, Kitty volunteers at the orphanage to help with anything, including cleaning up after the babies. Meanwhile, Walter points out to Colonel Yu that the river water is also contaminated because there's a cholera cemetery on its banks. He urges him to search every house in the village, since locals often hide infected bodies. Soon after, Walter finds Kitty at the orphanage. She greets him briefly and returns to her tasks. When the doctor warns the villagers about the river, they erupt in anger, believing that the spirits of their deceased must remain near the water. As if that weren't enough, Walter learns he can't remove the cemetery without permission from the local warlord. Fortunately, he comes up with a solution acceptable to all sides: a water wheel built farther away that brings clean water to the town. To carry out the project, he requests the warlord's permission, who immediately refuses, saying cholera is a matter of fate. Because the warlord doesn't speak English, Walter tells him that his suit is the most ridiculous he has ever seen, which makes Colonel Yu laugh. Instead of interpreting that remark literally, Yu threatens to invade the warlord's stronghold with his soldiers if he refuses to cooperate. Back in the village, Walter sees Kitty playing piano for the orphans, who happily jump around to her music. Until now, Walter hadn't paid much attention to Kitty's talent as a pianist. Watching her play, he recalls the night they met. At home, Kitty expresses her admiration for the nuns, but Walter disagrees, revealing that they often buy children from their families to convert them to their religion. Still, Kitty believes they're doing these children a favor, and that not everything is as grim and complicated as Walter makes it out to be. She actually loves simple things, like golf and parties, as opposed to the lengthy history lectures he used to give her in London. Surprisingly, that makes Walter smile, and he admits he was wrong to look for his own qualities in someone else. The next day, Kitty is on her way back from the orphanage when a protest erupts in the village. Locals immediately overpower her guard and start chasing her, cornering her in an alley. Just then, Walter shows up to rescue her, and before he can fight the townspeople, Kitty's guard fires a warning shot into the air to stop them. That night, the couple gets drunk at Waddington's house, where he tells them that his girlfriend Wang Shi is not a prostitute, but the youngest daughter of a family he helped escape from a political revolution. Instead of leaving with her family, Wang Shi followed Waddington until he had no choice but to take her in. After accidentally seeing Waddington and Wang Shi having relations, Walter and Kitty head home, not exactly to sleep. After that night of passion, Kitty is more cheerful and goes out to see her husband's work by the river. Walter responds by inviting her on a boat ride to show her the progress on the water wheel and water channels. Kitty continues her visits to the orphanage's music room until one day she suddenly vomits. Fortunately, it's not cholera, but a pregnancy. Walter is delighted to hear this news, but Kitty reveals she has been experiencing pregnancy symptoms for 2 months, meaning it started before their reconciliation. Walter says it doesn't matter if he is the father or not, because he is in love with her. Later, the doctor's project reaches completion as clean water flows into the village, and he regains the respect of the locals. However, not everything is good news. Colonel Yu reports that a large group of cholera-infected people are approaching the town. Immediately, Walter stops their march outside the village to treat them and prevent a second outbreak. After a while working at the refugee camp, Walter succumbs to the inevitable and falls ill. Rather than keeping her distance for the baby's sake, Kitty becomes his personal nurse and cares for him lovingly, despite all his suffering. Walter fights the disease until his last breath, asking Kitty for forgiveness at the end. Distraught, Kitty tells him he has nothing to apologize for. After witnessing Walter's burial, Kitty initially refuses to pack up her things, but with Waddington's help, she realizes she has to move on. 5 years later, we see Kitty walking through the streets of London with her son Walter on their way to visit the boy's grandfather. They run into Charles, who, upon learning the child's age, suspects he could be the father and indirectly suggests he and Kitty get together again. She immediately rejects him. As they continue on their way, little Walter asks who that man was. She replies that he's no one important.
If you want interesting movie recap